Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes, and today I have the immense pleasure of receiving Dr. Thornhill again on the show for the second time. He already appeared the first time where we talked basically about the evolutionary basis of rape as a reproductive strategy. By the way, for those of us who don't know him yet, he's a professor of biology at the University of New Mexico, but I really suggest that you go and check out our first interview because it's very interesting, and there I give you further information on Dr. Thornhill and other things as well. And so I decided to invite Dr. Thornhill a second time on the show because last time after the interview we talked a little bit more, and because I've already had Dr. Richard Nisbet on the show, eventually our conversation was led to some of his theories about cultures of honor and the differences between the northern and the southern Americans and the differences between them in terms of violence and laws and other stuff like that. And so Dr. Thornhill in his work talks about the influence that parasite-stress might have in certain aspects of human culture and in different cultures, and so we're here today basically to talk about that. So Dr. Thornhill, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show again.
My pleasure, Ricardo. Glad to be here.
Oh, great. So, first of all, I think it would be better for people to have at least a notion of what we're talking about here. So, could you please tell us what is the parasite-stress theory of values and sociality about?
Yes, the parasite-stress theory of values is a scientific theory about how people get their values. That is, what causes people's values. And I'll explain what I mean by values in a minute. But it's a proximate and evolutionary scientific theory of how we come by our core values. And basically, our core values are really what we want and need in life. On the proximate causal time scale, what we think is going on is that as people grow up, as kids grow up, they encounter varying levels of infectious disease. There's variation in this. And so some kids experience more infectious diseases growing up than others, and information about infectious diseases in the culture that these kids are growing up in. Some kids have highly activated immune systems as they're growing up because of local infectious disease levels are high, other kids not. And that affects these encounters with infectious disease and in basic information about infectious disease in the culture that the kids are growing up with affects the values that the kids acquire. And it's a strategic acquisition of values, so that if you're a kid growing up in high infectious disease areas, then you acquire values that protect you against infectious disease. If you're growing up under low infectious disease, then you don't need those values. And basically, the values of interest here are on a dimension, it's a continuous variable on a dimension, and the values are talked about in two different ways depending upon the area of scholarship you're referring to. And in political scientists talk about these core values of people on the conservatism liberalism dimension. So way over on the right, highly conservative, and way over on the left, highly liberal. And it's a continuous dimension of value. So you can place, political scientists have worked hard to come up with validated ways to measure individuals' values. You can measure an individual's values and put them on that dimension of values. And it works for groups, and you can get average values for states of the United States, average values for countries of the world, and so forth. Political scientists have done that. Also, from cultural psychology, cross-cultural psychology particularly, the same values basically are called collectivism and individualism. Collectivism being conservatism and individualism being liberalism. So those are the dimensions of values. And basically, if you take conservatism first, and values have received a lot of attention from researchers because, well, first of all, they're so important in human life, and our values, our core values, affect basically everything we do. They're fundamentally our wants and our needs. And so there's been a lot of research, descriptive research on values, how to measure values and so forth, and which values correlate with other values and so forth. Tremendous amount of research. And that research history is very interesting too. We can get to that later. When there were big increases in the research on values and so forth that are interesting. But basically, if you take conservatism first, the fundamental parts of conservatism are as follows. You have xenophobia as part of conservatism, and xenophobia is fear of outsiders, fear of foreigners, fear of people different from you, fear and avoidance, and fear all the way to hate of people with extreme xenophobia, to the point you want to kill them. You don't want to be around them and so forth. High xenophobia, and xenophobia is a continuous variable. It varies among individuals, and the more conservative a person is, the more xenophobic the person is. That's one fundamental part of conservatism. Another part of conservatism is an in-group focus, what scholars call ethnocentrism. So a focus on local, in-group people, preference for social interaction with people like you. They're in-group. They have the same values, they have the same language and dialect and appearance and so forth and so on. That kind of a value system is ethnocentrism, and the higher that is, the more conservative a person is. Another core value of conservatism is what biologists call philopatry, and it's love of where you grow up, basically. You just stay put, you don't disperse. So that's basically conservatism. Then if you, well, one more thing I would add there too is traditionalism. So you like traditional things. You want things, you want the status quo to remain. That's very much a part of conservatism too. And that's avoiding new. So neophobia is often used to describe that. And it's really part of xenophobia, because neophobia, new ideas and so forth, come from the outside. So you're avoiding outsiders again with neophobia, disliking new ideas and ways and so forth. So if we take that and contrast it with the other pole of the values dimension, the liberalism pole, you have liberal people are xenophilic. That is, they like foreigners and people that are different from them. And again, degree of liberalism predicts degree of xenophilic, how xenophilic a person is. Liberal people are fine with people that look different, speak different colors, have different values and so forth, more open to foreigners and people that are different from them. The ethnocentrism component differs too strongly between conservatives and liberals. Liberals, instead of being an in-group focus, they're out-group specialists. So they're focusing on people that are different from them and so forth. So low ethnocentrism in liberal people. And in terms of dispersal, liberals move around a lot. They don't mind moving around and traveling and to new places and adventure and all that kind of stuff. Frontier spirit, as some would call it. So those are basically the core differences, and liberals also are much more open to new experiences, new ways of doing things, and so forth. So less conformity and less traditionalism in liberals. So what conservatism does, from the standpoint of the parasite-stress theory of values, is that it protects one from infectious disease. So it's strategic, optimal under high infectious disease to adopt conservative values, because the xenophobia, it protects you from diseases from the outside carried by foreigners, people outside your in-group. That's what the xenophobia does. The ethnocentrism gives you all that local social support when diseases come. And the philopatry is associated with avoiding distant habitats that would have diseases you're not immune to. And fundamentally, the parasite-stress theory of values rests on basic ecology and evolution of infectious disease. And let me explain that briefly. So the way disease-host interactions work is they co-evolve. So hosts are co-evolving with their infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are co-evolving with their host. It's continuous, non-ending, and it's an arms race, an evolutionary arms race. So hosts are evolving defenses against infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are evolving to eat the host despite those defenses, circumvent those defenses. And this phenomenon occurs on a very local level, so that you get a geographic localization of immunity to infectious disease. So we are relatively immune to local infectious diseases, but not immune to diseases from over there, outside the local area. And that's why xenophobia is so important in high infectious disease areas, that component of conservatism. It's why ethnocentrism is also important. In areas of high infectious disease, you have all this social support. When diseases come, you can count on your in-group members to take care of you and your family. And why philopatry is so important. Under high infectious disease, you avoid dispersal into habitats that would have diseases you're not immune to. So it's very much rests on the basic ecology and evolution of infectious diseases. So that's basically the parasite-stress theory of values. And we've tested this theory, and we started coming up with this now about 14 years ago. And by 2008, we published a number of papers in the scientific literature, and we continued to do that, and we continue that research now. But we've tested this in lots of different ways. So basically, if you just take infectious disease number of infectious diseases, that's one variable. And that variable correlates very highly with the severity of infectious disease. Severity of infectious disease is the rate of infectious disease in an area, the portion of people that have infectious diseases. And these infectious disease data are available from outfits like the World Health Organization and other sources that keep continuous monitoring of infectious diseases across countries of the world. And then the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, keeps track of infectious disease levels across states of the United States. So we have these wonderful data on humans for number of infectious diseases and the severity of infectious diseases. And those two variables are very highly correlated. So if you've got a lot of infectious diseases in an area, you got high severity and so forth. But you can take either variable and then look at that variable in relation to the core value systems of people across countries of the world and across states of the U.S. And these data on core values were not collected by us for the most part. They were collected by cross-cultural psychologists and political scientists. So those are in the literature for countries of the world and states of the U.S. So we put those together. You put infectious disease levels across countries of the world and across states of the U.S. and find that they are very predictive of the core value systems across countries of the world and across states of the U.S. So as infectious disease increases across these regions, whether countries or states, conservatism increases. Said differently, collectivism increases if you're using that variable, which basically corresponds to conservatism. So as infectious disease level declines, liberalism or individualism increases across countries of the world and across states in the U.S. So we provided evidence that we now have an understanding, scientific understanding, causes of these core value systems that have been important in political science and cross-cultural psychology. That's one way we have looked at it. And others, so once we started publishing this, other researchers jumped in and started doing various kinds of research projects, and including at the individual level. So you can take, so this, what I just described, is comparative evidence across countries and across states about value systems in relation to infectious disease levels. But then experimental psychologists got involved, and you take people into the laboratory and you show them cues of infectious disease in a slideshow, say 10 slides. And these slides are of a person with skin pox or a person sneezing or dirty toilets or those kinds of cues of immediate parasite threat. And what happens is these people become more conservative immediately, more ethnocentric, more xenophobic, and personality changes too in a way that is consistent with the parasite-stress theory of values. It provides basically an understanding of personality variation too. We can get into that later, like extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, disagreeableness, and openness.
Openness to experience, right?
Pardon me?
Openness to experience.
Yeah, that's a fundamental personality thing. And openness is to new experiences is associated very strongly with liberalism. That's been known a long time. And that personality trait. And closed-mindedness, avoiding new experiences, neophobia, basically. Neophobia, fear of new, is associated with conservatism. Yes, indeed. Yeah. And you can change a person's personality in the lab just by showing them the slideshow I mentioned. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you got that at the individual level working, that kind of research. We didn't do that. Others have done that, and it continues. You look at, show people these cues of immediate threat of parasites, and you get changes in their value system immediately and personality immediately. This research has used good controls too. So, you show people cues of parasite threat. So maybe they're just changing their personality or values because there's some threat, any threat, right? But they've used other threats that show them slides of other kinds of threats, and people don't shift. It's specific. These shifts are specific to getting more conservative, specific to threats of parasites. So that research is very cool. Yeah. And then lots of other research directions too. People look at, so if you show people the slides of parasite threat, their values change in ways that would make them protective against parasites. But also they have their classical, what we call the classical immune system, increases too. Certain aspects of that kick in. We distinguish two kinds of people have two immune systems. They have the classical immune system, which is the old immune system first described by biologists and researched most. It's the T cells and thymus and all that stuff that you hear fundamentally about in immunology courses at university. But the behavioral immune system is the behavioral and psychological features that are as important as the classical immune system in dealing with infectious disease, and values are part of this behavioral immune system. Yeah.
Okay, so you've said a lot of things, Dr. Thornhill, and we have to unpack them individually.
Yeah.
But just before we go through each of them individually, let's just take a step back just for people to get a wider picture of all of this, because I mean, isn't it true that all of these, and we're talking here specifically about exposure to pathogens and infection, but there are many other environmental cues. But does this all start from the observation that our minds also are the result of natural selection and also have adaptations, and then when we are exposed to certain environmental cues, in this case parasites and pathogens and infection, then according to the levels of pathogens in the environment we live in, our cognitive systems perhaps tune to those cues and are influenced by it, and that's at the basis of why we develop certain cultural structures, why we prefer certain political systems, why perhaps in certain countries or in certain regions people tend to have a higher prevalence of certain personality traits and all of those things, right? Because I mean, there are people, particularly the more environmentally minded people, let's say, that tend to think that all of people's behavior in their culture and in their society, all of it comes from socio-cultural factors that have an influence in how they think and how they behave. But I mean, even culture is not something that we can separate from our biology, and it doesn't vary independently from some biological aspects, and it also doesn't vary randomly.
Right. Yes, I'm glad you brought all that up. So let me go back a little bit and then deal with those important points. So the parasite-stress theory of values is an ecological or proximate theory of values. That is, it deals with the causes within an individual's lifetime that bring about his or her values, the proximate level, and that's exposure to infectious diseases and information and so forth that I talked about. But also, the theory is an evolutionary or ultimate theory of how we get our values, and where that comes in was addressed by your comment. And so the way culture acquisition works is, I mean, the modern theory of how we get our culture, basically, how we get our cultural information, is that evolution by natural selection has built psychological adaptations that are specialized to function in the acquisition of cultural items that deal with local adversity, that impact local fitness effects. So ancestrally, these mechanisms were adaptive in human ancestral environments because these psychological mechanisms guided the adoption of cultural items that work to solve local adversity. And a good obvious example of that is language acquisition. So we acquire the language that is locally effective, okay, that deals with local adversity. So we acquire the language and even the dialect that is important for communication locally in the culture we grew up in. And all other culture acquisition works that way. That's why we have culture acquisition in the first place. It deals with these adaptations of culture acquisition are effective in dealing with solving problems of local adversity. You pull in information selectively, your cultural items, you build your cultural repertoire with items that work against local adversity. And it's the same with values. So you're going through life, and when you're a kid, you acquire the local dialect and so forth, because that's the best social strategy for communicating with people around you. That's a language. You also acquire these values that are effective against whatever the local disease adversity is. So that's the ultimate part of the parasite-stress theory of value, the evolutionary. So evolution by natural selection has built psychological adaptations that specialize in the acquisition of values that work locally to solve adversity. Indeed, and then so then you mentioned too the bigger picture of social structures and all that kind of stuff. I mentioned that you can take people into the laboratory and with slides change their values and personality and so forth, these parasite cues. But also on the personality dimension, we have looked, and others now too have looked cross-nationally at personality variation. So personality psychologists have described personality differences across basically all the countries of the world. Those data are in the literature. And so we pulled those data on personality variation across countries and showed that conservatism or collectivism and infectious disease levels are very predictive of the personality data that have been collected by personality psychologists. And other aspects of social structure, economic stuff, we've looked at, call it the parasite-stress theory of economics, a new theory of economics that deals with some important features of economics. So like diffusion of innovation. Economists have been very interested in diffusion of technologies. So new technologies, do they flow into a country or state, or do they not? So they're classical data sets on the flow of technologies into countries. And countries vary tremendously in whether they have modern medicine or whether they have modern this or modern that in terms of new technologies. And we show that parasite stress is a strong predictor, and conservatism and liberalism. So the more conservative the country, the less innovations come in. They just don't like the new stuff, basically. It comes out of that. The more liberal the place, the more up-to-date technologically the country is, the more liberal. And so that's an aspect. And also the wealth disparity is another big issue in economics. Why do countries vary in so much in how the wealth is distributed among people? Why do countries vary so much in property rights and so forth? Who can own property? Why do countries vary so much in these fundamental economic parameters has been a big question since the beginning of economics. And so basically what's going on is as conservatism in a region increases, then what is also increasing is the attitude of xenophobic and with conservatism you have strong classism too. So a view that some people are just more human than others. That's fundamentally part of conservatism. And high status people are good people, and low status people are bad people. People of out groups are bad, and so forth. And it's fine to disenfranchise them. So you get these tremendous wealth disparities associated with highly conservative places. And economists measure that as the Gini coefficient, G-I-N-I. They measure that every several years and publish data on all the countries of the world and how wealth is distributed. And the more conservative the country, the greater the disparity in wealth. And that's justified in the conservative mind because, these people at the top with the money are just better human beings than the others. That's fundamentally a part of conservatism and xenophobia and outgroup dislike and so forth. So we've done a lot with economics. And then governance, too, across countries of the world has been of great interest to us. So political scientists are very interested in how governance varies across countries. So countries vary from highly democratic to highly autocratic across the world. And political scientists have described that in detail. Descriptive data on how democratic, said differently, how autocratic, because these are on different poles, how democracy is low autocracy, high autocracy is low democracy. These measures for all the countries of the world. And we show that the more conservative the country, the more autocratic the country is. The more liberal the country, the more democratic the country is. And political scientists have 5 measures of democracy, said differently, of autocracy across countries of the world, and they're very highly correlated. But they're stuff like, depending on the measure, the degree to which certain parts of democracy are emphasized, like how widespread is the voting privileges of people in a country, how widespread is health care in a country, how about property rights, how can only the rich folks have property, or can everybody own property? Those kinds of things are part of democracy measures that political scientists have used. So we take all their measures and we show that they all are very strongly correlated with collectivism, more collectivism, less democracy, and very strongly correlated with infectious disease. More infectious disease, less democracy. So those kinds of things we've done a lot of, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically you've done a bunch of studies which allow for us to determine the arrow of causation, because, for example, people would tend to think that perhaps other factors, like, for example, GDP, and perhaps you could also give us other examples of confounding factors that come into the picture and that people put forth to try to explain several different traits that people have in terms of their political preferences and personality and their in-group, out-group dynamics and things like that. But I mean, you controlled for those other political, cultural and social factors, and the levels of pathogen exposure, that was still the factor that had prevalence over the others in terms of the effects that it had in explaining all of these behavioral variables, correct?
That's correct. So, yeah, basically, that's a good point. So in the kind of comparative analysis we do, like across countries of the world or across states of the U.S., if we're looking at infectious disease in relation to some variable or conservatism in relation to some variable, we very carefully look at the literature of scholarship in that area to see what scholars have thought is important in predicting, like, democracy, degree of democracy, and so forth. And then we control statistically with standard analytical techniques. We control statistically for those things that the scholars traditionally have thought were important, and show when we do those controls that our theoretical variables of interest, parasites and conservatism, are very powerful predictors, even when those other things are removed from having an effect by analysis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about personality traits now. Because, again, people could say that perhaps it is not really the exposure to certain levels of pathogens that make for for a certain prevalence of certain personality traits in a given area or a given country, but it would be the other way around, that it is because people have some personality traits that they then tend to deal with other people in a certain way. But again, you control for that, and there's a very high correlation between exposure to certain pathogens and to certain levels of pathogens in different areas in the world, and the prevalence of certain personality traits. And by the way, are those personality traits related primarily to extroversion, agreeableness, and openness to experience when it comes to the big five? Is that correct?
Those are the three. Those are the three that are predictable from conservatism and parasite stress. Yeah. So as conservatism increases or in parasite stress increases, you get less openness to new experiences, less. So as liberalism increases, you get more openness. And as parasite stress increases, you get less agreeableness. Okay, and that's a weird personality trait. We can talk about that. But then you also get, as infectious disease increases or conservatism increases, which is the same thing basically, you get less extroversion, more introversion, and introversion is socially protective. So if you're introverted, then you're less open to, contacting strangers and so forth. That's what that's for, introversion. But agreeableness, and the way, this big five thing, it was not erected. The big five personality taxonomy was not erected from evolutionary theory. It's not erected from knowledge of the design of people's minds. It was erected just analytically. So you take these measures of personality, and then you throw all that together and look at what things clump with the other things, and you get five factors coming out of analysis. And agreeableness is an interesting one in that regard, because what you expect on theoretical grounds when you think about the parasite stress theory is that conservatives are going to be very agreeable within group. They're not going to be agreeable with out group, right? And liberals, however, are going to be more agreeable with in group and out group. So these personality things really need some work to clean that kind of thing up. Extroversion, introversion is okay because it works fine, and openness to experiences and all, that's basically measuring neophobia or neophilia, degree of that. That one's fine. But really the parasite stress theory illuminates the need for much more thinking about the kinds of personality traits people have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what kinds of effects do we get when you're talking about people that are part of the in-group? Is it also the case that perhaps when people live in environments that promote a higher number of infectious diseases, particularly from human origin, that even people that are part of the same group also deal with each other differently? I mean, is it, for example, the case that in a situation like that, even if people are part of the same group, that perhaps they have less trust, there's less trust between those people of the same group and other aspects like that?
Right. Those kind of yes, indeed, I agree with you. It's going to affect, if you live in an area of high infectious disease, then that will affect your social interactions within group people as well. If you're going to avoid out group, definitely, because of you have local immunity, but not distant immunity. And so, but at the same time, how you interact with in-group members is going to be affected too, of course, and more caution with in-group members and that kind of thing. Yeah. So when people get sick, they tend to be avoided, and even by in-group members. So yeah, that's there as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And talking about how parasite stress affects culture, would you say that perhaps another way by which it affects it is because, for example, if people are exposed to other people that have different behaviors, different habits, different cultural traditions, that it might work as a proxy for them to belonging to other groups.
Mm-hmm. As a cue that that there's a threat of foreigners there. Yeah. 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 So I mean, if you look at a conservative group, everybody, there's, conformity. That's associated with conservatism. The more conservative, the more they conform. So everybody thinks the same way. Everybody looks the same. Everybody follows the same rules and all. So any kind of deviation from that is easy to detect, and people will pick up on that and punish or ostracize the person who's behaving in even a slightly different way, like being a little left-handed or something like that. Like, I'm left-handed. Yeah, and with their colleagues did an analysis where they looked at handedness across countries of the world. There were like 79 countries where data. There are about 200 countries in the world, so they had 79 countries where researchers had measured from good sampling handedness, and what they found was that the more conservative the country, more parasites in the country, the fewer left-handed people there were. So there's incredible pressure to conform in terms of handedness in conservative countries. So you don't get many left-handers.
Yeah, yes, and perhaps this is really not a thing that people tend to associate with being exposed to environmental conditions that promote the development of infectious disease, right?
Right, sure, and yeah, all that is outside the conscious realm. Of course, of people, they just and basically the way that behavioral immune system works is it overshoots. It accepts a lot of false positives, as we say. That is, it exaggerates in interpreting cues of disease threat, and that's why you get these prejudices, not only toward people that look different, talk different, and so forth, but prejudices associated with conservatism, of homophobia, prejudices against people that are overweight, that are underweight. All that's very strongly tied to conservatism, and in fact, all the prejudices are associated with conservatism. So. And I should add, too, that somewhere in this discussion, that the parasite stress theory of values is a scientific theory, and hence it doesn't judge people's values. We all have our values, and we judge based on our personal values, but the science itself makes no judgment of a person's values. It just gives you the causes of the values. It doesn't judge them. And it doesn't say that conservatives are more moral than liberals or vice versa. It doesn't have anything to say about that, the science itself. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, and I was just about to bring it up. I mean, when we're saying that certain groups of people tend to behave toward out groups or even people from their own group in certain ways, but that perhaps sometimes they are more conservative or more liberal or more violent or less violent,
Yeah.
and things like that, we're not making judgments here. We're just describing how things are, and I mean, even I would say that if people are to pick on these descriptions and say that this is a good thing or this is a bad thing, that then they are committing the naturalistic fallacy, because they are deriving moral values or moral judgments from scientific facts.
Right. Indeed. Yeah, it's important to keep that in mind, and not to make the naturalistic fallacy to deduce that what is true in the world, what is factual about the world, gives you moral guidance. Yeah, that's just not part of the program. Yeah.